Planetary war is something most astrologers are familiar with, if not actively practicing. It's a very simple concept. Planetary war is stated to be when two planets are within 1 degree of each other. However, that 1 degree is not a degree of zodiacal longitude. It's actually a degree of something else. And that's something most astrologers don't understand, and as a result, they're calculating planetary war incorrectly. So most astrologers would say, well, I've got Mars at 3 degrees Aries and Venus at 3.5 degree Aries. They're within a degree, therefore they're at war. Not necessarily true. Okay? Planetary war, according to Surya Siddhanta and according to Varahamihira, requires much, much more elaborate calculations than simply saying they're within a degree of zodiacal longitude. In fact, planetary war is meant to be calculated more on observational degree. So when you look out your window at night and see what's going on, if then from your point of view as an observer, do they look like they're within 1 degree? The truth is they can be right on top of each other in respect to the zodiac, in respect to the zodiacal degree, but from your point of view on Earth, when you look out the window, they can be really far apart. Some of you might have done that before. You might have looked at calculated a chart and seen, geez, right now Sun or Mercury and Venus are in exact conjunction. Let's go look. And you run outside and you look and you see that they're not. And you know, from your point of view, they look like they're miles, you know, just degrees and degrees apart. And you're going, how can they be so far apart if they're in conjunction? Well, the reason is because from your frame of reference, the zodiacal degrees get skewed in what it appears like from Earth. So they simply would not be in a visual conjunction. So where the Surya Siddhanta calls this procedure for calculating planetary war correctly, the operation for apparent placement. Apparent meaning the place that you actually see. Okay? So that's what we're going to learn today, is how to calculate planetary war. Now, first of all, planetary war only happens between the starry grahas, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. Sun never gets involved in planetary war. Instead, a planet that's right next to the Sun gets combust or becomes invisible because it's so close to the Sun. And the Moon does not involve itself in planetary war either. The reason the Moon doesn't is because the Moon is simply traveling through a different territory than are the starry planets. The starry planets are traveling around the Sun. The Moon is traveling around the Earth. It's in a completely different frame of reference that the Moon is traveling. So even when it's in exact degree with another planet, it's not fighting them. It's not in war with them. But the 5 starry planets, since they're traveling in the same realm, when they're in conjunction, they actually have a war. You can look at it like this. You can't have a war on 2 different fields. You know, for a war to happen, both armies have to be meeting in the same territory. If you've got one army in one territory and another in another territory, they're not going to have a war. Even if, from a third territory, you can see both territories lining up and looking like they're close together. If they're in different territories, they're just not going to have a war. And of course, planets don't engage in war with the Sun because they're revolving around the Sun. The Sun's not in their territory at all. And so they're thought to rise and set, is the words they use in Hindu astrology, with the Sun. They set to the Sun as they conjunct it, and then they rise from the Sun as they pass the conjunction. And we'll cover that topic more when we talk about combustion and also Cheshtabala in Shadbala. But for now, we're going to talk about planetary war, which means Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn only. Okay? So, how do we do planetary war? Well, to do that, we have to go back to local space. You want to have listened to the local space video in the astronomy section if you haven't already done so. Otherwise, none of this is going to make sense. So local space is the space surrounding you, so that when you look out the window, all the heavens that you see, all the space you see around you, that's your local space. And from the point of view of local space, you're going to be sitting right here in the middle of this huge sphere of space surrounding you. And one of the things you'll see in that local space is the ecliptic, which is the path that the planets are traveling. Okay? So let's put two planets on the ecliptic. Let's put a planet here, and let's put a planet here. Okay? Now, if we were to measure those two planets in respect to zodiacal degrees, what we would do, we would take a line from the planet. Oops, let me get a line just a second. Take a line from the planet and draw it to a perpendicular to the ecliptic. And whatever degree of the ecliptic, or the zodiac, because the ecliptic is the zodiac, whatever the degree of the ecliptic the planet that line intersected would be the degree of that planet. And this planet would do the same. And we can see these two planets are really close to each other on the ecliptic. Now they're far away from each other because this planet has a north latitude on the ecliptic and this planet has a southern latitude on the ecliptic. And planets can have can be 9 degrees north or south of the ecliptic. As they travel, they go north and south. So they don't just travel along this perfect line. They travel up and then they'll travel down and so on. So these two planets are an exact same degree on the ecliptic. So most astrologers would say, well, these two planets are in planetary war. But no, they're not. According to the Surya Siddhanta, according to Varahamihira, planetary war has to be calculated in respect to the prime vertical. So study up your local space class so you remember what the prime vertical is. But basically the prime vertical is the important line of local space line in Hindu astrology, and it's used for many important things. It's the most important line. So the prime vertical, to loosely say how you'll see it, it's the line that things are going to be rising over the eastern horizon on. So when you look towards the eastern horizon and you watch things rise over the horizon, the sun rises in the morning, then it sets, and then as it sets it gets dark, and then you start seeing all these stars and planets rising on the eastern horizon. Well, basically you're going to see those things rising over the eastern horizon along this path. Those things are not going to rise along the path of the ecliptic. They're going to rise along the path in respect to how the Earth is turning relevant to where you are on Earth, which means the prime vertical. Okay, so now let's measure these two planets in respect to the prime vertical. If we measure that along a line to the prime vertical, we draw one line here and we draw one line here. And you see how far apart those two planets are in respect to the prime vertical? What this means is this planet is going to rise, and then much later this planet will rise from your point of view as an observer. And so they're not in planetary war. From your visual point of view of what you see from your local place on Earth, which is this little red dot, these two planets are going to look this far apart. You know, this far apart. They're not going to look like they're conjunct. You know, and so they're not considered to be in planetary war. So planetary war requires us to make a lot of extra calculations where we start with the zodiacal degrees, do all these very painful and elaborate calculations, and then find out if they're truly in planetary war. And the mathematical calculations in that section of Surya Siddhanta are probably the most difficult, confusing, hair-pulling calculations in the entire book. And after reading them, you'll have an easy understanding of why astrologers chose to shortcut the method and calculate planetary war based on the ecliptic. But the truth is, calculating planetary war based on the ecliptic or zodiacal degrees is only going to work when the planets have a really similar latitude. So say I got a planet, so let's do like green this time. So I got one planet here. Okay, one planet here on the ecliptic. All right, that green guy. And then I'm going to put another planet on the ecliptic right here. Since they have a very similar latitude, and now we're going to figure out their degree. One's going to intersect here. Let's see, right here actually. One's intersecting obviously there, and the other one is going to intersect there. Those lines won't even come up. But anyway, you can see just real easily these two planets are within a degree of ecliptic longitude, of zodiacal longitude. And if we draw lines, we measure them in respect to the prime vertical, they're also going to be really close to each other on the prime vertical, within a degree most likely. So when planets are within a degree of each other in zodiacal degrees, and if their latitude is very close, then they'll be in planetary war. But if their latitude is not within a couple degrees, they're not going to be in planetary war. And the truth is, most of the time, they're not within a couple degrees of latitude. On the average, planets will be 4 to 7 degrees apart in latitude, which means they won't be in planetary war when you think they are if you measure them along the ecliptic. So these are very painful calculations, and most astrologers just skip them. In fact, one astrologer I know who's really considered to be knowledgeable in astronomy, he came up to me one day, he goes, I really studied the chapter in Surya Siddhanta and Planetary War. I went through it back and forth to try to figure out who's the winner of the war and wrote this big article on it. Here's the article. Well, I checked out the article. Nowhere in that article did he mention the proper calculation of calculating planetary war. It was so painful to read that section that everyone just skips it and goes right to the end of the chapter where it says the winner of the war is determined by this. And I have to admit, when I read that chapter, it was extremely painful too, and I didn't understand half of it. But so I contacted a friend of mine, Dieter Koch, who is probably the best astrologer or astronomer on the planet. When you want to get an astrologer that really knows astronomy and how to program astrology so the computer can do the calculations properly, he's definitely one of the top 3 guys on the planet. So I asked him about it, and because I wanted help so I could program it into our software and actually test it and use it. So luckily I had him as a resource, because otherwise I think I would have been banging my head for a very long time trying to figure out exactly what the Surya Siddhanta was telling us to do. So that's just to give you an idea of the difficulty of those calculations. They're so difficult that even advanced astrologers who have a good foundation of astronomy, in fact, that one astrologer I was telling you about had a master's in astronomy, and or was getting it or had it, I don't remember. And that part he just glossed over. It's an easy thing to skip because it just seems it's such a convoluted calculation. So as a result, all the astrologers just decided, hey, we'll just measure it along the ecliptic, measure it zodiacally. But they're not measuring planetary war then. They're just measuring an exact conjunction on the ecliptic, which means the planet will be in the same Rashi, in the same Navamsha, in the same Drekana, in the same Vargas, but it won't be in planetary war. Now, a lot of very critical things emerge when we calculate planetary war correctly. One of them is that planetary war is something based on point of view. So, planetary war can be happening in Los Angeles, but not in New York. Therefore, there's rioting in Los Angeles, but not in New York. And planetary war is really important in world events. And it's not happening everywhere at the same time. 2 planets can be in planetary war in one part of Earth, but not on another part of Earth, because the local space changes from the point of view of the observer, which basically means this angle here, the degree of these planets' separation along the prime vertical, will change as a person moves north and south on the globe. If a person's at, just by the North Pole, this angle will be different than if he's on the equator, let's say. Okay, so it's something that's based on local space, which means the observer of the locality, or from observation from the locality, and it's not happening in all places at all times. Planetary war is a completely space-based principle, just like the ascendant. The ascendant that's happening right here where I am right now is different than the ascendant that's happening in India right now. The ascendant is a completely space-based thing. Then there's some things that are time-based, which means they're the same at the same place at all times. Right now, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus are pretty much an exact conjunction. They're doing that in America, and they're doing that in India. Okay? But because they're not based on local space. But things like planetary war that are based on local space are going to change at different places on Earth. So planetary war is what gives one country a boon and hurts another country, okay, when it happens. All parts of the world are not treated equally. All right, so we have to calculate planetary war along this. Kala software is the only software that calculates planetary war properly. No other software does it this way. So, how do you know in Kala if there's a planetary war happening? Well, what you do is you pull up your Shadbala and you look. If under Yud B, which stands for Yuddha Bala, and Yuddha means war, Bala means strength, so that's strength due to planetary war. If you see one number with a positive and another number with a negative, that means planetary war is happening on that chart. Okay? So in this chart, it is. We got Mars with a plus 153 and Saturn with a minus 153. So these two planets are in war, and you know that Saturn's the loser because he has the negative, and Mars is the winner because he has the positive. In Shadbala, when two planets are in planetary war, the winner gets a lot of strength, and the loser loses some strength, and it loses an equivalent amount of strength. Okay, so that's how you can tell if there's a planetary war. You can also right-click on your screen and pull up your Shadbala big screen, and under, where is it? Plus minus for Yuddha, which means plus minus for war, you can see Mars is getting 152.6 and Saturn's losing 152.6 points. So that's how you can see if two planets are in war. There's no way you can tell there's two planets in war by glancing at the chart. Look at this chart. Saturn's at 3 degrees Cancer and Mars is at 9 degrees Cancer. They're a full 6 degrees away, yet they're still in war. Okay? How can that be? Well, the reason is, if we go over here and we look at the latitude, Mars is sitting at a latitude of 1 degrees and 3 minutes. Saturn's sitting at minus 1 degrees and 38 minutes. So they're a little over 2.5 degrees apart in latitude, and happening at a point where from this person's birth, which is down under, and a down under birth, you know, the further you go north or south on the globe, so the closer you are to the South Pole, the closer you are to the North Pole, the more you get a shift in the heavens, which means the further away planets can be and still be in planetary war. The closer you are to the equator, the less that shift is present. Okay, so this is planetary war between Saturn and Mars, even though zodiacally they are 6 degrees apart. So coming back to here, let's pretend that this planet is Mars and this planet is Saturn. Oh, okay. No, let's not do that. We need to get some better planets on here. Just a second. Let's put Mars at 6 degrees, or a planet at 6 degrees. Okay, and then we're going to put another planet at, 3 degrees and 9 degrees, I think. So anyway, we're just going to put two planets about 6 degrees apart here. Okay, they're not in planetary war. Let me see if I can make this look right. That's the latitude of that. All right, I know what I need to do to make it work. All right, now we've got two planets. Let me make a circle for that planet too. Okay. We got two planets. The degrees of this planet to the ecliptic falls there on the ecliptic. And the degree of this planet to the ecliptic falls here. They're 6 degrees apart. But from the prime vertical, we cut to a square to the prime vertical. We get that, and then we cut to a square to the prime vertical, meaning a 9-degree perpendicular intersection. They're really close. They're within a degree. So they're actually in planetary war in that chart. Pretty amazing, huh? Now, you'll notice in this, and this is a really surprising thing, in this chart, one reason I use it as an example, is Venus is right between Saturn and Mars. Okay? But Venus is not in planetary war. How can that be if Venus is right between them? Well, because he's in between them in zodiacal degrees, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be between them in planetary war degrees. So going back to here, we got to put a planet in between here, zodiacally. So let's put Venus up here. Okay? And we're going to give Venus more north latitude. So now Venus is up here. Zodiacally, he's right between the two planets in war, but he's got a lot more latitude. So when we draw a line over to the prime vertical from there, we can see that along the prime vertical, it becomes far apart. And so that planet escapes the war, and only Mars and Venus. So as the planets rise over the horizon, these two planets rise at a similar time and are therefore at war. This planet rises way earlier, Venus, so it's not at war. So you see how that works? That's how we calculate planetary war. And that's just the beginning. After we've calculated planetary war, the question is, how do we determine the winner of the war? Before we jump onto that, just this illustration gives you the basic idea. We can have two planets in zodiacal conjunction, which from the point of view of how the planets are rising on the Earth are not in conjunction. This is the plane, this line right here is the plane of where planets are rising up along the prime vertical. And no, they are not in planetary war. Where here we've got two planets that zodiacally are far apart, but are rising across the prime meridian the prime vertical at the same time. Okay, so I think I said prime meridian over here too. No, prime vertical is what we're talking about. Okay, these are the ones in planetary war, even though they're separated here. And again, when planets are close to the ecliptic, when they're right on the ecliptic, then they'll be in planetary war, even and still be within a degree of zodiacal space. Okay. So, how do we determine the winner? Parashar gives a real simple rule. Venus is the victor whether moving in the north or south, and the others are victorious when moving in the north at mutual conjunction. So Parashar tells us that the planet that is furthest north wins the war. North means that the planet is furthest north. Here's North Pole, okay? And the way to find the planet that's furthest north is we see how far north or south it is of the equator. Here's the equator. The more north the planet is of the equator, the better. The better chance it'll win the war. That measurement, how far north or south the planet is from the equator, that's called a planet's declination. So declination, where do you find that? Well, if you go to your planetary information screen and call up here and move it over, you'll find DECL for declination. And we'll move that over since we're going to use it. Usually it's not something most people use, so it's kind of stuck in the back. But if it's something you want to study for a while, just drag it to the front like I'm doing here. Almost there. Alright, now we've got our declination right in the first row. So Mars and Saturn are the planets at war. Mars is at 2258 north declination, so it's really far north of the equator. Saturn's at 19 degrees and 18 minutes north of the equator, which means Mars is about 3.5 degrees further north than Saturn, so Mars wins the war. Now the question is, why is the north the winner? Why do they choose the north? The only reason I can think of is that if you look at a war as a competition where each planet is trying to get somewhere before the other, or get something before the other. From a symbolic point of view, the goal on life is to get to the North Pole. That's the goal. That's the North Pole symbolizes enlightenment and the highest development that something can achieve. And so maybe that's the goal the two planets are fighting for. So whichever planet is closest to that goal gets to win. So that's how I sort of look at it. Why they actually chose it, I don't know. But the northern hemisphere and the North Pole amongst the northern hemisphere is always considered the more auspicious place. Okay, so I think the planet that's closest to that is selected as the winner. So that's a pretty simple thing to do. Now Surya Siddhanta gets a little more complicated than that. Surya Siddhanta throws in that the brighter planet will win even if in the south. So even if the brighter planet's in the south, it'll win. And that has to be used in the proper context. First of all, you have to understand what are the darkest to the brightest planets. Well, Saturn's the darkest planet. Mars is a little brighter than Saturn. Mercury's brighter than Mars. Jupiter's brighter than Mercury. And Venus is the brightest of the planets. And you remember Prosher said Venus is the victor, whether moving in the north or south. Venus always wins. Probably because he's so bright. He's so much brighter than the other planets, so there's no chance of him losing. So Saturn, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus is the order of brightness. That's what we call the natural order of brightness, which means on an average day, that'll be the order of the brightnesses of the planets. However, as the planets move through their rotation, they come closer to Earth and move further away from Earth. So sometimes a planet will be brighter and sometimes it'll be dimmer than its average. And you might have remembered in last year or the year before, people were talking a lot about how we need to go out and look at Mars, because right now Mars was brighter than it had been in 200 years, and it would be a couple hundred years before it ever was that bright again, because it was so close to Earth because of how everything moves that it just was going to be a couple centuries before it was ever that close again. So that's what happens with the planets. So sometimes it's possible that a planet that's normally not as bright as another planet, gets brighter. So on a very rare occasion, Mars might be so close to Earth and Mercury far enough away that Mars actually gets a little brighter than Mercury. If something like that happens, then the planet that's normally not brighter wins. Okay, and then you don't even have to be concerned if that planet's north or south. Those are very, very rare occasions. And for 99% of cases, you can just go with the northernmost planet and be right. But on very, very rare occasions, the planet that's usually less bright will be more bright, in which case he wins. So the first step to calculating the winner of planetary war is we have to find out the diameter of the planet's disk and how close that planet is to Earth. And through that, we're able to calculate exactly how bright the planet is. The bigger the disk of the planet, meaning the bigger the thing we see up in the sky is, the brighter it's going to be. And of course, as a planet moves closer to Earth, it looks bigger. As it moves further away, it looks smaller, and so it gets less bright. So based on those very difficult calculations for determining exactly how far from Earth the planet is, and it's based on its size, we're able to calculate how bright a planet is. And so if the planet is brighter than the one it's at war at, even though normally it's less bright, then that planet wins. And those are calculations that no one in their right mind is going to want to do. So luckily we have software that does that. And as far as I know, CALA is the only software that calculates brightness for determining planetary war. Although Sri Jyoti may do it, because Andrew Foss is a good astronomer and he may have put that in there as well. But as far as I know, there's no chance of any other software out there that calculates brightness as a factor in determining the winner. In most cases, it's not that important. In rare cases, it'll make a difference. So when you see the planet in planetary war, the brightness needs to be checked. If the brightness order is normal, meaning if the planets are Mercury and Jupiter, and Jupiter is brighter than normal, then you see, or is brighter than Mercury, which is the normal thing, then you see which planet has the highest, most northern declination. Okay? And on checking declination, planets with a negative number, that means they're in south declination. Okay? And then you have to go in reverse to figure out the distance. So minus 10 is 10 degrees south. Minus 9 is 9 degrees south. The winner of that planet war would be the planet at minus 9, because minus 9 is a little more north than minus 10. Okay? But if the planet that's normally darker, Mercury in this case, is actually brighter than Jupiter, then Mercury wins automatically whether he's in the north or the south. Okay? Now, how do we use planetary war? Oh, one other important point. Really important. Planetary war isn't only determined astronomically, which means it's based on what you see astronomically. It's not based on anything in the Varga charts. So if you see two planets within a degree in a Varga chart, they're not in planetary war. Okay? Only, this is an observational thing. So, what happens to a planet in planetary war? Just real briefly, and we'll get more involved in other courses of actually using planetary war. A planet in planetary war becomes padita, which means pressed, or a better word is oppressed. So just like if there's a war, the winner oppresses the people and subjugates their rights and eats their food, that's what the winner of the war does to the planet who loses. Therefore, the planet who loses has less energy to create his bhavas and less energy to take care of the things he represents. So if Jupiter loses war, he has less energy for creating and protecting children, finances, and spirituality and philosophy. And if he rules, say, the third house and the sixth house, will also have less energy to take care of the health, to exercise, and to study. Okay? So whatever that planet rules in the chart, if he loses planetary war, he doesn't have as much energy to do that. Okay? Now, planetary war can be used as a snapshot method, which means you see a planetary war and you see a planet's in bad shape and you say bad things about that planet. You say, well, you're in Jupiter Dasha and it's overcoming planetary war, so you're going to feel a real lack of financially, philosophically, and with your children, and if you're wanting to have kids, it's not likely you're going to have kids in Jupiter, period. And there's a very good chance that some or all of that will come true. And it's a pretty decent way to use planetary war in a snapshot fashion. You just remember that that planet is going to be able to produce less of what it represents. Simple. But that's not always going to be the case, because sometimes a planet in planetary war becomes really, really weak. And other times a planet that, loses planetary war only loses a little bit of strength. Let's take this chart, for example, with Saturn and Mars. You'll see in the Shadbala table, Mars is gaining 153 points and Saturn's losing 153. So Saturn's really getting killed here. He's losing like half his points. He's down to 155 points. He would have had 298 points, almost 300 points, which would have been, okay. Would have been decent for Saturn. But instead, he's reduced to almost half that. So, when a planet loses a lot of strength in planetary war, then it's going to really have a hard time producing. And by a lot of strength, I mean if a planet's in planetary war and its percent drops below 100%, it's going to be very detrimental. This planet has dropped to 52%, extremely detrimental. Okay. Now, why is it in this chart that Mars picks up 153 and Saturn loses 153? Well, after we determine there's planetary war, we take the Shadbala of one planet and the Shadbala of the other, and we find the difference between their two Shadbalas. And whatever that difference is, we add that difference to the winner and we subtract that difference to the loser. So if two planets like this, Saturn and Mars, have a huge difference in Shadbala, 153 points, then Saturn's going to lose a lot. But if Mars and Saturn and Shadbala were, say, only 10 points different, then Saturn would only lose 10 points and Mars would only gain 10 points. So Saturn only losing 10 points would be really negligible and wouldn't make much of an impact. So before you jump onto making predictions about, oh, this planet's in planetary war and it's all over for that planet, look and see how much strength that planet is actually losing in the war by opening up your Shadbala and seeing how much negative is there. Okay? Is it a big negative? If it's a big enough negative to put the percentage of required strength, which is this percentage here, below 100%, then that planet's going to be lacking a lot more. Now, the winner of a planetary war, well, what happens with him? The winner of the planetary war gets more energy to produce the things it represents. And what that means is the person makes the choice to put more energy into the things of the winning planet and less energy into the things of the losing planet. Okay? So usually the winner of the planetary war gets lots of strength and will be a real prominent planet in the chart. And the things it rules and represents, the person will do a lot of those things in their life. But sometimes the winner of the war might be so weak to begin with that even when he gets some strength from the other planet, his percentage of required strength may still be below 100%. If that's the case, he's still not going to be able to do very much. So the bottom line is to use planetary war more accurately, instead of just snapshotting it and saying this planet's in planetary war, you're not going to have any of those things because he loses. And the planet who wins, you're going to have lots of that because he wins. Before jumping to that conclusion, it's a good idea to jump to your Shadbala. I'll pull it up in the big table too, so those of you who use those can see it there. Plus minus for Yuddha, you can say, well, Mars is gaining 152 points, and its required is well above 100%. So Mars is definitely going to be able to produce as a winner of that war. But let's say Mars was weak to start with, and even after gaining 150 points was still only at 95% of what it needed. It would not be that robust of a planet. Okay? Saturn here gets killed losing 152.6 points, drops his Shadbala total to 155. He needs 300 points. 155 is way less than 300. So his percent of required comes down to 51%, which is extremely low. That Saturn is not going to be able to produce hardly anything. Okay? If Saturn had only, say Saturn was so strong to begin with that after losing the war, he still had over 100% of required strength, say he had 105% of required strength, he would still have enough strength to get a lot of things done. He wouldn't be as good as he would have been, but he's not going to be useless. Okay? So look at those Shadbalas to help you gauge how critical that planetary war is. If that planetary war is making a really big deal in the chart, or is just a minor thing in the chart. It's interesting how I learned about this planetary war idea. I had a client come in, and they had Mercury and Venus in planetary war in the first house. And at the time, I was using the method that everyone teaches, that planetary war happens when two planets are within 1 degree of zodiacal longitude. So I said all kinds of things about their bad Mercury dasha, which they just finished, because Mercury had lost the war. And, all the limiting factors I talked about that Mercury, the client couldn't relate to it at all. They'd been super successful, made tons of money, had an incredible business, which they actually sold at an incredible profit. I mean, this person just, had like the best business and success throughout that entire Mercury period. Couldn't relate to any of the planetary war things I talked about in this respect to Mercury, whether it was business, friendships, or the bhavas that Mercury ruled. So I was really shocked. 3 days later, I got the Surya Siddhanta in the mail. I'd ordered the Surya Siddhanta like 2 days before she came in. Got the Surya Siddhanta, started reading it. One of the early chapters was on planetary war, the planet on conjunctions, where he covers planetary war. And I read all that, and I said, well, this is interesting. And then I calculated the planetary war, got my friend to help me, calculated it into Kala. And indeed, that client didn't have planetary war according to the Surya Siddhanta method. So then I started working with that method and found it to work much better. I wish I'd known it a week before so I wouldn't have fluffed on that person's chart and made all those mistakes. So calculate planetary war the way it's meant to, which means along the rising, meaning in respect to the planets rising along the prime vertical. That's the degrees we're interested in. For planetary war, we don't care about the ecliptic degrees, where it's at in the zodiac. So the only way to know if a planet's in planetary war is to look at your Shadbala and look under Yudabala. And that's only going to work in Kala software. No one else calculates planetary war correctly, to my knowledge at this point. Okay? It's a critical thing if you want to use it. And planetary war, because it's an integral part of Shadbala, which can lots of times make a huge shift in Shadbala strength, as it does in this in this particular chart, when you start doing really systematic Parashara techniques, which you use Shadbala for making predictions, if your Shadbala is off by 150 points, like in this chart, the Shadbala would have never, this chart with way most people calculate planetary war, this Shadbala would be much different. Saturn would have over 100%. Mars would still be robust, but not nearly at 187% where he is. And then if we use those Shadbala calculations to try to make predictions with, a person would fall on their face. So it's really critical to calculate planetary war correctly if you want to use Shadbala accurately. And even if you just want to snapshot planetary war and see it in the chart. Okay. So try that out on charts with planetary war. Grab some charts of people you know have planetary war or thought you knew had planetary war. Open them up in Kala, and you'll see some of them will have planetary war still, some of them won't. And then see what sounds more true. Did the ones who really don't have planetary war, can you kind of see how that's now more true? So kind of test this, Varahamihira and Surya Siddhanta planetary war method and see how much better it works. And then look at other charts and always pop open the Shadbala to see if there's indeed a planetary war there. And you'll find some charts where there's a planetary war, and that will help you explain some of the things about the chart that you were missing because you thought there wasn't a planetary war before that. At some point, we'll be making videos on using planetary war for determining, helping us with world events and also in the birth chart. But for now, the starting point is because using planetary war is really relatively simple. The planet gets oppressed and held back. We can't even begin to use that simple level of this technique if we don't calculate it right. So now you know how to calculate it right, so now you can start using it. Thank you.